a piece of Saul's coat, the end of it, right? And he did so, and he felt bad about it, but it was also proof to Saul, right? So David was showing mercy. We also learned that Samuel had died. We got one verse of that. And there was a side story too. Remember the side story, what happened with David and Nabal and Abigail? Remember that story? Kind of intervene. Yep, right. And that's important because that actually leads into our study this morning too a little bit. And also what became of that, what was the outcome of that story? What happened? Yep, Abigail became David's wife. And you know, I noticed one thing when I was reading yesterday. Remember how it always says that Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Well, if you read here too, it also says her name and the wife of Nabal. It's kind of interesting that the scripture includes that. So, because I know the scripture, there's a reason for it, but so David marries his second wife, and this too is going to be an issue later. And we pick up this morning in chapter 26, and what happens? Well, Saul is continuing his pursuit of David. So let's look at chapter 26 and verse 1. And then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding on the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jeshimon?" Jeshimon is desert. It's a desert kind on the western side of the lake. Not Galilee. Dead Sea. So Saul rose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having with him 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search for David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul camped in the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jeshimon. So they're on the Dead Sea side. They're on the eastern side, and which is before Jeshimon, beside the road. Now David was staying in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness. And I've never been there, but if you can kind of picture somewhere maybe as you're heading up into the mountains in Arizona where it starts to get hilly, the pictures that I looked at of this area is this is very, very desolate wilderness. And there's no water. It's really rough. Bob, have you been there? Yeah. It's a really rough area. So this is not a fun place to be running from somebody. So the scene shifts back again to this hill of Hachilah and this wilderness of Ziph. And if you remember, the Ziphites were involved before. What did the Ziphites do before? What did they do last time? Did they warn somebody or tell somebody about something? Remember that? Yep, right, exactly. Yep, good memory there. So yeah, so these Ziphites, which actually happens to be in Judah, these Ziphites who were the kindred brothers of David, were basically giving David up, right? And they did it again. And so they're warning Saul. So they're back in the same hill country as they were in chapter 23. And this is that area where David was surrounded. Remember, David was surrounded by Saul, and then he gets called away because the Philistines are raiding. And so these Ziphites, who were David's tribal brothers, betray him again. And it's interesting because if you go to Psalm 54, and you look at Psalm 54, that is the psalm that shares David's feelings and concerns about the Ziphites. And you can look at that on your own, but I'll just kind of summarize it. In Psalm 54, David talks about the Ziphites, and he says that they are ruthless men who have risen up against him, and they are seeking his life. So his own brothers, his own tribal brothers, are doing this. He continues to say that they do not fear God, but instead they seek the favor of Saul. Right. So instead of honoring God and God's next chosen king, they're going after the old regime. They're following Saul and seeking his favor. But David trusts God for his justice against the Ziphites and not him. And so even later on, he becomes king. He doesn't go after them. In the rest of chapter 26, we see Saul is back at it again, right? He's back at it, And this should tell you something about Saul's character. Remember what happened after he gets the hem of his robe, and Saul is, oh, I'm sorry, David, you're a great guy, right? And he's saying, you're a better man than me, you're going to be the next king. Well, what does he do? He's back at it again, right? And so this is nearly identical to chapter 24. In fact, you could almost overlay it, except just take away the clothing and add a spear and a water bottle. Right? So in verse 4 he says, so David sent out spies, and he knew that Saul was certainly coming. He knew it. He knew Saul was after him again. And David then arose and came to the place where Saul had camped. And David saw the place where Saul lay, as well as Abner the son of Ner, the commander of his army. And Saul was lying in the circle of a camp, and people were camped around him. So his army was in this area. Saul's in the middle. Abner's right next to him, and everybody's surrounding the king. Okay, he's very well protected, extremely well protected. So David asked two of his most trusted men, one a Hittite, it's kind of interesting, and the other Joab's brother, Abishai, and he asked one of them if they will go into the camp and spy it out with him. And so in verse 6, David says, then David answered and said to Abimelech the Hittite and Abishai the son of Zerhu, Joab's brother, saying, who will go down with me to Saul in the camp? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai came to the people by night, and behold, Saul lay sleeping inside the circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground behind his head, and the people were lying around him. So Abishai, he's the oldest son of his father Zeruk, and he says he will go with David. And a little side note here, Abishai is a true warrior. He's a serious warrior. He's one of the three brothers of this father Zeruk. And in 2 Samuel 23:18, he's noted for killing 300 of the enemy by himself with his spear. And he's also, which is very interesting, noted for killing Goliath's brother, his twin, right? His twin named Ishbi-Benob. He was another giant, and he kills very similarly. The story, if you look at that story, it's very similar to David's story also. So these two have a lot of similarities. It's pretty interesting. So Abishai is a real warrior. And in verse 8 he says, then Abishai said to David, today God has surrendered your enemy into your hands. So now, please let me strike him with the spear to the ground with one stroke, and I will not strike him a second time. I'm not sure why the concern is there with the second time, but he's saying, let me finish him off. Let me do it. I won't, I'm not going to put 20 holes in him, but I'm just going to do one good one. And verse 9, but David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can send forth his hand against the anointed of Yahweh and be without guilt? So David still respects God's anointed. You remember back in the cave, he was even had second thoughts because he actually touched the king's cloak, which was, that you're not even supposed to do that. And so David said, do not destroy him, for who can send forth his hand against the anointed of Yahweh and be without guilt? Verse 10, David said, also, as Yahweh lives, surely Yahweh will smite him, or his day will come that he dies, or he will go down into battle and be swept away. So David, knowing all this, David knows that he's going to be continue to be pursued by Saul, and yet instead of himself in his hand destroying Saul, he's going to trust that God is going to take care of him, that God is going to do what he's going to do. Yahweh forbid, verse 11, that I should send forth my hand against the anointed of Yahweh, but now please take the spear that is at his head and the jug of water and let us go. So amazing that these guys snuck in, had a conversation there, took his spear, no, you're not going to kill him, walk out with his water bottle and spear. And in verse 12, so David took the spear and the jug of water bottle from beside Saul's head, and they went away. But no one saw, or no one knew, nor did any awake. Wow, pretty amazing, right? If you have potentially thousands of guys here, and not one of them saw it, not one heard, and not one awoke, that's a little unusual, isn't it? Because there's usually always, if you're on a bunch of group of men, there's always somebody out using the toilet somewhere, right? Almost always, right? Somebody's going to be doing something out there. But they were all asleep. And because of how? How was that? What does it say? God did it. Yeah, God put him into a deep sleep, right? So the deep sleep from a sound sleep, it says in the LSB, from Yahweh had fallen on them. So this was God's doing. God did it, right? God was with David, right? It sounds very familiar, doesn't the story? In verse 10 it says, Yahweh will smite him. Yahweh. So David, going back to that story, we're going back to our review. Remember what Abigail did. Abigail interceded before Nabal and said, don't do it, take me, let me be responsible, all that. Well, David thanked her because, she intervened from him killing Nabal, right? And he was very thankful about that. Instead, what happened to Nabal? What happened to him? What's that? Yeah. And who's that from? From God, right? Yeah, from God. And David, understands, that I'm not putting my hand against the anointed, especially against Saul, right? So he learns that vengeance belongs to God, right? Nabal was brought to justice by God, and so will Saul. And who kept David safe when they went into camp? Well, it was Yahweh, right? Yahweh kept him safe. Verse 13, David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of the mountain at a distance with a large area in between them. Talk about acoustics. Boy, that's pretty good that you can be that far away from a hill to a hill and talk to the camp that they were just in, that Saul was in. In verse 14 it says, and David called to the people and to Abner the son of Ner, saying, will you not answer, Abner? Then Abner answered and said, who are you who calls to the king? All right. So now we're getting this little dialogue going on here. So Abner answers for the king, which he should have, because he was the king's protector. Verse 15, so David said to Abner, are you not a man? Are you, and who is like you in Israel? In other words, who has your position to guard the king of Israel? You are responsible for the king of Israel's security. Why then have you not guarded your lord the king? For one of the people, referring to Abishai who was with him, came to destroy the king your lord. So he makes it clear that it wasn't him, singular, but one of the people that was with him, and that was Abishai, wanted to kill the king, right? So what does David do? He starts off mocking Abner. He's mocking him. First of all, he calls his manhood into question and said, are you not a man? Right? Are you not a man? So he's calling his competency into question and his job of keeping the king safe. This thing, verse 16, is not good what you have done. As Yahweh lives, all of you must surely die because you did not keep watch over your Lord, the anointed of Yahweh. So he's laying a pretty heavy word on him, isn't he? So now see where the king's spear is and the jug of water that was at his head. So, and he has proof. He has proof too. Not only did, we sneak into all of you guys, none of you were alerted, but you, Abner, was right next to the king. You didn't protect your king. We could have very easily have taken his life. So it's almost like a courtroom, and David pronounces judgment, and his judgment over Abner and the troops is a sentence of death, right? And because why? They failed to protect the king. And this would not have been an uncommon punishment for somebody in these times. If you failed to protect the king, you may not have lived, right? And so and like I said, he offers up Saul's spear and a jug of water as evidence that they were there. And you'll notice who never says another word in this dialogue. Who does not say another word? Abner. Abner's like, oh, right? He's done. He's not saying anymore. He's pretty embarrassed at this point. And verse 17, then Saul recognized David's voice and says, is this your voice, my son David? And David said, it is my voice, my lord the king. So we have a little dialogue going on here. They seem to be very similar in that they're humble, that they seem to be like that they're talking to each other very nicely, right? Verse 18, he said, Why then is my Lord pursuing his servant? For what have I done, or what evil is in my hand? So now please let the Lord my king listen to the words of his servants. Okay? So we have two people talking. Saul, oh, David, is this my son David speaking? Right? I'm just out here to kill you, right? It's okay. Yeah? And David's going, why are you pursuing me? What have I done? Right? So talk. We have talk. And then we have action, don't we? We have action. And action always speaks louder than words, don't it? David's actions, twice, David's actions were what? Honorable, right? Merciful, weren't they? Honoring to God, weren't they? And Saul demonstrated his actions twice in these situations by what? Speaking falsely, right? He didn't speak the truth, did he? He kept going after David. And I would throw in their pride. And he had contempt for David. And all this was a lack of trust in God, right? He didn't trust God. So David asked him, what evil have I done? Why are you pursuing me? If Yahweh has incited you against me, verse 19, he says, let him accept my offering. So David's saying, if I've done something to sin against Yahweh, may he offering. It's like an aroma when they would sacrifice, would be the aroma would go before God, and it would please God, and it would appease him. And David's saying, well, let my, I'll come before God and offer up my, confession of sin, if that's the case, and my offering before him. But if it is men, cursed are they before Yahweh. And Saul knows what he's saying here. Saul knows. So if men have incited you against me, David pronounces a curse, doesn't he? Let Yahweh judge their sin. And Saul knows he's talking to them. For they have driven me out today so that I would have no attachment with the inheritance of Yahweh, saying, go serve other gods. Very interesting statement there in the end. So what is he talking about there? Well, in those times, in ancient times, the gods were local gods, right? You have a god of the hills, you have the god of the valleys, the god of the Philistines, the storm gods. They all had their place, and they all had their little section. Of course, Yahweh has no limitation, right? Yahweh is everywhere. But what David's talking about here, he says, when he would be driven out of Israel, it was like a kind of a slap in the face. I've been pushed away from my people. I've been pushed away from my inheritance, which in this case, a covenantal inheritance is not only land, but his covenant with his people and with his God. And the end there where it says, go serve other gods. This would be what would happen if somebody was pushed away from their homes, is that they would be in a land of a foreign god, right? And they wouldn't be able to worship God. In this case, they wouldn't be able to worship at the tabernacle. They wouldn't be able to worship David wouldn't be able to worship with his people. So it's a kind of a big deal. And David's saying, hey, I'm being pushed out. I'm being pushed out of my community. I'm being pushed out from where I can serve God and into an area where there's other gods, right? And in these times, these pagans believed that these gods were all local. So verse 20, so now do not let my blood fall to the ground from the presence of Yahweh. In other words, stop pursuing me, Saul. Stop chasing me. For the king of Israel has come out to search for a single flea, just as one pursues a partridge in the mountains. You're wasting all of Israel's resources. You're wasting all the time that it takes to come after little me, just me, right? You have big enemies. You have the Amalekites. You have the Philistines. You have all these nations that are surrounding you that are trying to take you out. Matter of fact, the last time he got called away because the Philistines were raiding, right? Because he was pursuing David. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Here we go again, right? Here we go. I have sinned, David. Return, my son David, for I will not harm you because my life was precious in your sight. If that was the case, he wouldn't be trying to chuck a spear at him, right? He wouldn't be going after him. And, so this is, I think we really see a contrast here, but as believers, it's not about what people say, right? People can say the most holiest, loveliest, greatest things, and yet their actions may not back it up, right? Right? So we have to be discerning. And what does John say? What does it say in the Epistle of John? How does John say to judge others by what? How do we judge others? We can't judge their hearts, right? By their fruit, right. We judge others by their fruit, specifically there, false teachers, but we can only see what they've done. John?
What I was going to say is he confessed his sin to David, but he needed to confess it to God.
Right, yep.
That would have been the difference.
Yep. And even back when he was confronted by Samuel, remember back in against the Amalekites in Agag, who did he confess to? Remember that? Same thing. He confessed to Samuel. He didn't confess to God. Is Samuel, forgive me, Samuel, speak for Yahweh for me. He never went to God. So yeah, it's very interesting when you read this how this is just a lot of talk, right? And you look at, we'll see what David's response is to this. For I will not harm you because again, I'm not harm you again because life was precious in your sight this day. Behold, I have played the fool and have committed a serious error. Who is he talking to? Right, John? Yep. It's another lie. Verse 22, and David replied, behold, the spear of the king. David's not even engaged in this. Says, here's the spear. Now let one of the young men come over and take it. David doesn't even trust that Saul is going to come over and get a spear without doing something. So he says, one of your young men, none of your warriors, not a platoon, one of your guys. So he's heard it all before, and he asked wisely just to send one guy to come retrieve his spear. Now Yahweh will repay each man for his righteousness, in verse 23, and his faithfulness. For Yahweh gave you into my hand today, for I was not willing to set forth my hand against the anointed of Yahweh. David is talking, and David is backing it up, right? He has done it twice. Now behold, as your life was highly valued in my sight this day, so may my life be valued highly in the sight of Yahweh, and may he deliver me from all my distress. Isn't that so neat? David trusted in God, right? David trusted that God would protect him. When you read through the Psalms, which is interesting, when you start going to the Psalms and you read the Psalms and you see all the Psalms explain David's heart, his feelings, all those things, and David is like, God saved me from my enemies, right? I trust in you, and you just really see a man who puts his trust in God. Obviously, he wasn't perfect. We know that later. We'll see that, right? But he's a guy who still trusts in God, even when he has sinned. Let's see, where are we? Okay. So verse 25. Then Saul said to David, blessed are you, here we go again, blessed are you, David, my son. You will both accomplish much and surely prevail. In other words, you're going to take my place, you're going to do much, you're going to overcome. And David just went his way and Saul went to his place. Same thing. Now chapter 27. So what does David do with all this? Well, then David said in his heart, now I will surely be swept away one day by the hand of Saul. He doesn't buy it, right? He's been through this route before. He knows what's going to happen. There's nothing better for me than I should utterly escape into the land of the Philistines. Saul then will despair searching for me anymore in all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand. So David finally decides, you know what, I've got to get out of here, and this isn't just going to work out anymore. And so we'll see here as we go into this, David is not only traveling with himself and his troops, but David is traveling with his wives and his troops' wives and his troops' families. So it's not a bunch of guys running around with spears. This is all their families. And you're running around in some of the harshest wilderness in Israel, right? There's barely any water. It's rugged. There's caves. And I'm sure that they were well adapted to surviving in these conditions, but it would have been very tough. And so, practically speaking, David realizes he can't continue to do this in this wilderness. It's not going to work out. So, in one sense, Saul has temporarily succeeded in driving David out of the territory of Israel. And in knowing this, and we refer to that verse before that, David is essentially giving up his inheritance. When you're a Jew, your inheritance is the biggest thing. In these times, your inheritance, what your connection is to the covenant God of Israel, is your land and your family and your tribe. That is such an important part of your life. That's your connection. And David, by leaving, and not only leaving, but going to the most hated enemies of Israel, is a big deal. It's very interesting. Um, Verse 2, so David arose and crossed over. So they were on the eastern side, the Dead Sea side, and they crossed all the way across Israel, and they went to the western side to where the Philistines are, he and his 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Mahach, the king of Gath. Very interesting. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each with his household, even David with his 2 wives, Anoman and Nomia of the Jezreelites, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's wife. There you go, that Nabal's wife thing. So David crosses over. He goes from east to west, and he goes into the most hated enemy of Israel, the Philistines. Wow, that is such a crazy thing, isn't it? It's just amazing. And not only to the Philistines, but the Philistines of Gath. Remember who was from the Philistines of Gath? Who was it? Goliath was. Goliath was from the Philistines of Gath, right? Remember, for 40 days he taunted Israel. This wasn't, this is a pretty big deal. So if there was, I thought if there was a Jerusalem Gazette in that day, if there was some kind of mainstream media, this would have been a huge betrayal of Israel, wouldn't it? They would have plastered that all over the place, especially, in the land that gave David over. They would have really probably ripped them in the press, right? And so this would have been a huge betrayal. So David goes back to Gath, and he flees to Achish, the son of Moach. Now, the Achish, there was another Achish who fought against Israel, and that's the one with Goliath. Well, that Achish is probably and almost for certainly different than this Achish. And not only is Achish different, but Achish is probably not a name, it's probably a title. It's probably a title of a Philistine lord, okay? So, but this Achish is said to be the son of Moach. And Moach was probably the Achish who was king during Goliath's time. And remember in chapter 21, if you think back, and I don't know who was here too on that one, but in chapter 21, remember David went and escaped to the Philistines one time, and what did he do? Remember that? Trying to be insane, right? Because he feared the king, right? He feared that they were going to do something to him. Well, the way he approaches this Achish is a lot different, right? This Achish appears to be more accepting, and so there's definitely a difference between them. In verse 4, he says, and it was told to Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, if now I have found favor in your sight, let them give me a place in one of the cities in the country that I may live there, for why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day, in other words, to the day of this writing. And the number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. So David requests from this Achish, he requests him to give him asylum, right? He asked for asylum. And actually, this wasn't an uncommon practice. When a lord or a king was seeking asylum in another country, it wasn't an uncommon thing. And in this case, David's seeking asylum in his enemy, right? And Achish agrees to it. The little deal that goes with that, though, is that the one who seeks asylum becomes a servant of that king. So it benefits that king, right? That king, the lord who seeks asylum, no longer is lord of his life. He is serving another now, right? He becomes a vassal of that king. And David asks for autonomy, so he asks for a place that's outside the capital, some place of his own, but it's also a place that protects him from Saul. It's if you look at it, it's actually a place that keeps him kind of out of Saul's reach. In verse 8, now David and his men went up and raided the Gershurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for they were inhabitants of the land from ancient times, as you come to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. And David struck the land and did not leave a man or a woman alive, and he took away the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, and their clothing. Then he returned and came to Achish. So these three folks, the Gershurites, the Girzites, and Amalekites, anybody want to take a guess what God thought about them? What's that? Yeah, God, these are these are all family, these are all tribal groups that God said, get them out, wipe them out, kick them out of my land, push them out, right? It, when we read this as modern day, domesticated people, this sounds very harsh, doesn't it? But this wasn't. This wasn't a harsh thing. This was commanded by God. And God not only said, wipe everybody out, but even in the case of where Saul didn't do it with the Amalekites, remember, Saul kept the good stuff and that kind of thing. Well, they were supposed to wipe everything out. In this case, David kept the stuff to give and show the king, hey, I did this, and here's the fruits of this, and I'm going to give it to you. And he would give some of that to the Philistine king. Just hey, this is what I'm doing for you, king. And this is what happens. Verse 10. And Achish said, "Where have you made a raid today?" Right. So now he's the vassal of the king. He's the vassal of Achish, and he's expected to serve Achish and do what he wants. And David said, "Against the what? The Negev of Judah and the Jerahmeelites and the Kenites." Do you know where those areas are? Negev is south. And where is the Negev of Judah? Is that in the Philistines' land? No. So David did a little lie here, didn't he? David did a little lie. There's times in the Bible where folks have lied. I'm trying to think of one time maybe Elisha did, and there are several folks in there that, men of God, women of God who told little lies, right? Well, and there's one example of it. And David said, no, I went out and raided my own, those people who kicked me out, I went and raided them, right? And the Negev, the southern part of Israel. And David said, and David did not leave a man or woman alive to bring to Gath, saying, lest they tell about us, saying, so has David done, and so has been his custom all the time he has lived in the country of the Philistines. So not only was he obeying God's word by wiping out these people, because that was the mandate for Israel, but he also had a secondary reason for wiping them all out, and that was what? So that they couldn't come back and say, oh, this is what David's been doing. He's been raiding us, right? So Achish couldn't say, well, no, you haven't been going to Judah, you haven't been going to Israel, you've been raiding locally. And so he wipes them out. There's no witnesses, right? Dead people don't talk, right? So Achish believed David. This ruse has worked. He has surely made himself odious among his people, Israel. Therefore, he will become my servant forever. So Achish is saying, you got nowhere else to go now. You've made an enemy of your own people, and now you're forever going to be serving me. He was stoked about this, right? He was very happy about this. But David's ruse has worked. And these three folks, like I mentioned, the Amalekites, the Girgashites, and the Geshurites, these were, like I said, these were all enemies of Israel. Yes?
So if he was a vassal of Achish and he was raiding and doing all the stuff that God wanted him to do, Achish was just okay with whatever he was doing,
Yeah.
even though he answered to Achish now?
Yep. Yeah, but he was lying to him, as we saw, because Achish thought he was raiding Israel, but instead he's raiding the people that were the enemies of Israel, right? So there's the lie, hence the little lie there. But he's gained Achish's favor, though. That was his plan. That was his goal. Well, it gives you one of the things I see about David here is David's he's a thinker and he's a talker, right? He's able to to engage and be able to kind of think these things through, which is interesting. We kind of get a little bit of personality about him, right? Yeah. So these were people that God said, kick them out, right? The Amalekites, remember, we talked about that. Agag was the king of the Amalekites, and Saul, remember, his big reason he got in trouble was he didn't do what God told him to do, which was to wipe out the Amalekites, kill the king, not take anything, and Saul, of course, didn't do that, right? And so, but Achish believed that David was so hated by his people, though, that he would serve him the rest of his life. Let me go drop down to in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 19, and you can look this up later. But in Deuteronomy 25:19, God commands Israel to quote, blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You must not forget. Okay? So this is God's command to Israel. Blot out the memory of Amalek, or the Amalekites. Blot them out. Amalek was the great-grandson of Esau. So, great-grandson of Esau. Wipe them out. I don't want any memory of them. So this is what God commanded to do. And David, at this time, particularly when he was younger, he was gung-ho, wasn't he? He wanted to serve God no matter what it took, and we see it. But later on, I just kind of want to throw this in here. But later on, David's zeal for God wanes. Let me give you a little example of this. David ended up actually marrying a Amalekite princess named Maacah. And who was Maacah? Well, Maacah was the mother of Absalom and Tamar. Okay? Absalom, Tamar. What was Absalom? Remember what happened with Absalom? Tried to take over the kingdom. He even killed his own dad, right? He was the third son of this Amalekite princess. And this was a political marriage, right? David, later on in his life, marries an Amalekite princess and most think it was to ratify some kind of treaty between Israel and the Amalekites, which were like the Golan Heights area, I believe. So David was, instead of his zeal for God, what is he doing? He starts to get more political as he gets older. So just something to think about there, right? And we all know what happened is that ended up that was the reason. Well, because of that was because of another woman, right? The judgment of Absalom and Tamar was kind of baked into the cake, so to speak, right? God in his sovereignty allowed all this to happen, and we know why, because David eventually sinned with somebody else, right? Another lady. Remember that? What's that? Bathsheba, right? Bathsheba, yep. And his son kind of inherited his problems too, isn't it? His son kind of took on the problems of his dad. Okay, verse 28. So now we're shifting. We see that David has got inroads now with the king of the Philistines, and now he's kind of buddied up to him. And verse 28, the Philistines prepare for war. So in verse 1, now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men. Uh-oh. So now, all this ruse and all this stuff now Achish is saying, I want you now to ride beside me, and then we're going to go and attack we're going to go and attack Israel now. That would put you in a pretty bad position, wouldn't it? Right? Now you'd be, at least I was be in that position. I'd be thinking about every excuse I could. I don't think I'm feeling good. I think it's a bad day. The calendar's full. Whatever, right? Something. But something. This is not good, is it? And so partly what some folks think is that the king believed that David weakened Israel so much by all his raiding that he thought it would be a good time to go in and attack, and it's possible. So Achish tells David, you're going to go to battle with me. And verse 2, and David said to Achish, what does he say? Very well, you shall know what your servant can do. In other words, hey, all right, and I'm going to prove to you that I am what they say I am. I'm going to go in and, kick, what, right? David's, it's really, really interesting, right? That's a very bold statement, isn't it? And to me, I think we're going to see that David fully trusts in God, that he's not going to allow David to have to fight his own people or anything like that. And Achish is so excited about this. What was his answer? Very well, I will what? Make you my chief guardian forever, and the LSB, my bodyguard for life. My bodyguard for life. There's a little bit of irony in this, because that word for bodyguard, it actually means literally keeper of the head. So his position was the keeper of the king's head. What's ironic about this? Because remember another guy from Gath? What did David do to that guy from Gath? He removed his head off, right? And so now he is in the keeper of the head's position. So very interesting there. But Achish is really happy. He's excited about this. Not only was David raiding Israel, so he thought, right? But David agrees to ride with Achish against his own people. And that would have been a really big deal for, hey, now, he's riding with me against you. That would really be demoralizing for Israel, wouldn't it? And so that story kind of that ends kind of abruptly. It picks up later, but now we get to Saul and the medium of Endor. And it's a very well-known story for many of you. So now we get this viewpoint from Saul in this upcoming battle. And beginning in verse 3, we're going to see 5 conditions that drove Saul to seek a medium. And verse 3 says, Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. That's only the second mention of Samuel's death. And Saul, those two. And Saul had removed from the land those who were mediums and spirits. So prior to all this, Saul removed all the the magic workers, all the witchcraft, all the necromancers, these people were calling, talking to the dead, all this stuff. So Saul had done that. Verse 4, so the Philistines gathered together and came and camped in Shunem. And so remember, that verse is thrown in there for a reason. I don't remember, somebody the other day mentioned this in one of the classes that, we see sometimes you see in Scripture, something's thrown in, it seems out of place. Why did it get thrown in there? Well, there's a reason for it, right? So Samuel is dead. Israel laments for him. It's been some time since, this has happened. It takes a while to lament over, death. So this has been quite some time. And Saul removed, and it doesn't necessarily happen this time, but somewhere in the past, Saul had removed the mediums and spiritists. And so now, and it jumps back into the dialogue here. So now the Philistines gathered together and came and camped in Shunem, and Saul gathered all of Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa. Saul saw the camp of the Philistines and was what? He was afraid, and his heart trembled, right? It's like his heart was shaking within him. So Saul asked of Yahweh, but Yahweh did not answer him, either by what? There's three ways that Israel would receive revelation from God, either by dreams, speaking directly, like to Elijah or the kings, and by Urim. Anybody know what by Urim represents? And who was the office of that? The priests, right? The priests, right? So the priests would speak for God, and the other one, the third one was where am I at here? The prophets, right? The prophets. So these were the 3 wings. Well, unfortunately, Saul killed off all the priests except for one, and he was with David. So that option wasn't good. Yahweh wasn't talking to him anymore, and the only prophet they had in Israel was dead, right? So Saul had nothing to go on now. So what does he do? Saul's thinking, how am I going to get some help here? So he circumvents the whole system, right? He circumvents all of God's system, and what does he do? Okay, well, maybe I'll do this way. And this is what we're looking at now. So Saul is greatly fearful of what's going on. Yahweh is silent. The Philistines have gathered for war, and according to chapter 29, it's a massive army. And Saul has no way to talk to God. So Saul, instead of doing the normal route, we're going to see these words here. In verse 8, he says, divine for me. In other words, magically divine for me. In verse 8 and verse 11, he says, bring up. And that's a word that talks about necromancy, bringing up the spirits of the dead. And in verse 15, he says, call to or invoke, and that is communication with the dead. So we're going to see that Saul turns to the occult, and he turns to paganism, right? In verse 7, so Saul said to the servant, seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And a servant said to him, behold, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor, which was close to them. Then Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes, and he went and he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night, and he said, divine for me, please, and bring up for me whom I shall say to you. Saul knows that this stuff is demonic. He knows that this stuff works, all right, in a sense, because he bashed them all, right? He knows this stuff is legitimate, but he knows it's also evil. He knows it's wrong. But he's got all the verbiage down. He knows what to do here, right? He says, call up from me, whom I say. And verse 9, but the woman said to him, behold, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off those who are mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you then laying a snare for my life to bring about my death, right? She's concerned, because this was the past practice to get rid of him, right? And verse 10, then Saul swore to her by Yahweh. Wow. Saul swore to her by Yahweh, saying, as Yahweh lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Is that pretty rough? You know, I don't want to be going and calling on necromancy and occult stuff and then swearing by the name of God. Well, you know, this is pretty serious, isn't it? Not only is Saul sinning by turning to a medium, which is punishable, it's a capital offense, by the way, punishable by being dispossessed or cut off from the land, right? But ironically, he does what? He swears by God. He swears by Yahweh. Pretty serious stuff. And also, too, as I was thinking about it, he's also breaking the 3rd commandment. He's also breaking the 3rd commandment. What is the 3rd commandment? Remember that? What's that? Nope. Do not take God's name in vain. Right. What is Saul doing here? He's taking God's name in vain. Vain means to be futile or worthless or a flippant way, isn't it? That's what Saul's doing. He's taking God's name in vain. He's breaking the 3rd commandment too. One commentator put it like this: is by turning to a medium to receive guidance for his life, Saul committed a capital offense, and 24 hours later he was dead. Right? Right. Yeah, his name. Right. Yep. Verse 11, then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up for me Samuel. And the woman saw Samuel. There might have been some time in here, but as Samuel came up, but the woman somehow, she knew it was Samuel. And the woman saw Samuel and cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. Somehow she knew all this, and we're not told why. But she goes, you have deceived me. Right? Even this witch has learned that Saul is being deceptive to him, right? To her. So he continues, and he says in verse 13, and the king said to her, do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up out of the earth. And he said to her, what is his form? And she said, as an old man he is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and prostrated himself. It's almost like as if he's worshiping Samuel, right? And we don't really have time to get into this, but just want you to kind of see that the Old Testament saints, they come from out of the earth. Anytime we see this, it's always from out of the earth, right? They always come from above. They come up, and the Jew always understood a Sheol as the place of the dead. It's called the grave, right? And some would say that the Old Testament saints went to heaven. I kind of don't agree with that. I think that every example of it is that they're in the earth. And I think if you look back at Luke 16, you'll see where Jesus gives that picture clearly. He talks about the former rich man who is in turmoil and being tortured, and we see Abraham's bosom, and they're in the same place, right? But anyways, he comes up, and he's coming up out of the earth, and we weren't going to get into the reasons how that happened and why God chose to do that. God is God, and he allowed it to happen. But he did. And so Samuel comes up, and this is Samuel, right? He's coming up. He's in some kind of glorified form. And then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Right? And Saul answered, I am greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has turned away from me, no longer answers me, either by the hand of the prophets or dreams. Therefore I have called you. He circumvented the system, right? And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since Yahweh has turned away from you and has become your what? Your enemy, your adversary, right? Your enemy." And this is where I'll go. And I think last week BJ had mentioned that some commentators thought that Saul was saved. Personally, I don't go that route. I don't think he was. I think that that all his words were words, and he never backed them up with actions. He killed all the priests of Yahweh. He turns to a medium, and in this case, really very clear here is that he is the enemy of God. And nowhere do I find anywhere in Scripture, where in the Old or New Testament, where somebody who was called an enemy of God was a believer, right? And that's just my opinion. I can't say for sure, but I don't see that with Saul. Where David, I do, right? David, I do. You can see that. And verse. He never did. Yep. That's true. Yep. Verse 17, so Yahweh has done accordingly as he has spoke by my hand, for Yahweh has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. As you did not listen to the voice of Yahweh and did not execute his burning anger on Amalek, so Yahweh has done this thing to you this day. Remember, obedience is better than sacrifice, right? Moreover, Yahweh will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Indeed, Yahweh will give over the camp of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. And some would say, well, that means that Samuel's in heaven and that him and his sons are going to go to heaven to be with him. But that's not what the Jew would have thought. The Jew didn't think that way. The Jew said they would go to be with their fathers and they were going to go to the grave. They understood it as Sheol, right? And if that's what Jesus represented in Luke 16, which was still also the Old Testament because he hadn't died yet, so that would, in my opinion, this is talking about Sheol, that Saul and his sons were going to go to Sheol with them, right? Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Some use this verse, skip that part. Let's go on that. Let's just finish up here. Then David, verse 20, then Saul quickly fell full length upon the ground and was very afraid because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul and saw that he was terrified and said to him, behold, your servant woman has listened to your voice, and I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to your words which you spoke to me. So now also please listen to the voice of your servant woman, and let me seek a piece of bread for you that you may eat and have strength when you go on your way. But he refused and said, I will not eat. However, his servants together with the woman urged him, and he listened to them. So he arose from the ground and sat on the bed. And the woman had a fatted calf in his house, and she quickly sacrificed it. She took flour, kneaded it, and baked it, unleavened bread from it. And she brought it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they arose and they went away that night. Interesting, huh? Very interesting. You know, even this witch, the people that were there that Saul was talking to in this room, his troops, and they all have some form of religion, don't they? They go, I'm going to sacrifice this animal, and then we're going to eat it together, and you know, they all have this appearance of being religious, right? It's so typical even today that men seek to be appeased with God, but on their own means, right? Instead of by God's means, instead by God's ways, how God wants us to approach Him. You know, people have their own way to make themselves right with God. So, very interesting, isn't it? Very cool. Any last questions, or I know we're out of time here. Any questions or any thoughts? I saw a few hands earlier. I had to rush through this. Okay.